Hey all, what's up? My name is Angela and today I have a few historical fiction recommendations if you normally don't like historical fiction. I had, and I still think I currently have, this aversion to historical fiction where it's something about anytime I see something that starts in like it's 1900s Germany, immediately brain shuts off. I don't want to read it. And I really do think it's because the historical fiction market has an oversaturation of historical fiction set in Europe during World War II. And it's an important time, but that doesn't mean all of our fiction needs to be set in that time. So here are a few recommendations for if you want to try historical fiction but kind of don't want that kind of historical fiction. My first recommendation is The Silence of Bones by June Her. This is set in the 1800s in Korea and follows our main character Sol, who is an indentured servant to the police bureau. She ends up helping one of the police investigators with a murder case of a noblewoman and finds herself in this position where she is trying to find the truth, but she doesn't know who to really trust. This book was the perfect combination of suspense, thriller, with kind of this really rich historical setting. I think a lot of the details of the setting were worked really well into the narrative, so it didn't feel like you were getting like a mini history lesson if you weren't really familiar with 1800s Korea. The character building was also superb. I really enjoyed the dynamics between Sol and Han. You know, they have this kind of large class gap that they have to kind of overcome to properly communicate throughout the case, and you feel this really strong friendship and bond that happens between them. For fans of true crime / kind of procedural police work, I think this will be an A+ pick for you. My next recommendation is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. So this kind of toes the line for historical fiction because it is quite recent. It's set in the 1960s to 1970s. So historical, I guess, as we get older. This book is set in a small village called Barkley Cove, and it follows our main character Kaya Clark, who is also known as Marsh Girl. She's basically become this legend within this small village because she's a little bit wild and she's more in touch with nature than she is with socializing with other people, and she's always kind of lived on the marsh. In 1969, the village's it guy, Chase, is found dead, and so the first person that gets suspected is, of course, Marsh Girl. This book jumps around a little bit in the timeline where we follow Kaya as she's growing up, and then how she's tied to Chase, as well as her part in this murder case. So I read this book all in one sitting, and what I really loved about it was how absolutely captivating the style was. So the author is so detailed in describing exactly what the marsh looks like, exactly what the village feels like. Like, I think she almost describes what the air tastes like. It just feels so real, and you're immediately transported into this small town, and it just feels so alive. Again, if you kind of like these slightly suspenseful stories, this one isn't really as much of like a traditional suspense thriller. It's not supposed to be scary, but it does carry this very strong tension through it because there's a death at hand, right? So they're gonna tell you what happens. You basically have this kind of dueling sense of like this peace and calm from the environment, but then also this really scary, intense situation from Kaya and this murder that's happening in this small town. So absolutely would recommend finish it in one setting, even better. Next book is The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is part of the Diviners series, and it's set in the 1920s in New York City. This book mainly follows Evie O'Neill, who is a bit of a wild child. She kind of gets into a little bit of trouble within her family's social circle, so she gets shipped off to her uncle in New York City, who runs this supernatural museum. Her uncle gets scouted to be a consultant for the police on this series of murder cases that are quite strange and a little bit occulty, and so Evie kind of inserts herself into the case because she has this supernatural gift where she can get images of other people's lives and what they were doing by touching their personal items. The setting of this book was just so colorful, so diverse, and so just detailed. I think what makes really good historical fiction is when you add a lot of detail to a place and time that you're not super familiar with. So I wasn't really super familiar with 1920s America, and so just the diversity of New York City, the details of the restaurants, the nightlife, the culture, the way people talked, it was just so charming. And I personally kind of really enjoyed the way Evie brought us along to the most kind of fun parts of living as a teenager during that time. And we not only follow Evie, we actually follow a ton of different characters who all come from pretty different walks of life. Like we get the point of view of Theta, who is this up and coming actress, showgirl, I think. So she kind of like starts from absolutely nothing and makes her way to the top. And then we also follow Memphis, who is kind of like the, can I say he's like the errand guy for this kind of mob boss? Like he's not a mob boss, but like he kind of is like the boss of the area. So we get people from really interesting backgrounds, mix that with a plot with lots of really exciting supernatural and true crime elements, and you get a great book. You know, now that I'm thinking about it, all of my recommendations so far have had this kind of like true crime element to it. Maybe that's the kind of direction I'm heading in. Maybe like true crime historical fiction is where I should just settle myself at. Conversation for another time, but this book was also really, really good. So if you haven't picked up The Diviners yet, would highly recommend it. Next book is Boxers by Jean Luen Yang. This is set in the late 1800s, early 1900s in China. This is during a time where a lot of foreign nations and soldiers were basically taking over the Chinese countryside and kind of bullying the people there. And so our main character Bao, he has had enough of it, and he basically harnesses the powers of these very ancient Chinese gods, and he is able to get this band of soldiers together who are just peasants, but he trains them and basically leads a small army to try to reclaim their country. So to my understanding, even though the main character and the participation from the Chinese gods is fictional in this book, the setting and this army in China was a real part of history. And I think I've always really liked this author's art style. I read American Born Chinese, which absolutely loved. If you want to read like a really great graphic novel about like a Chinese American's experience, that's also a great book to check out. But back to Boxers, I think it's such a violent and really kind of awful time in history, and not one that often gets talked about in a Western classroom. And so I think this was really interesting to pick up, to learn more about. And even though this is a pretty serious book, this author is great at injecting little bits of humor wherever he can. So yeah, A+, please check out Boxers. The next book is hands down one of my favorite books I've ever read. It's The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. This is set in 17th century Europe, and it follows our main character Monty, who is a little bit of the black sheep of the family, and he kind of gets into a lot of trouble, and his father ends up sending him on a grand tour of Europe where he kind of expects him to come back like whipped into shape. And Monty goes on to this tour with his best friend Percy and his little sister Felicity. The three of them were just kind of expecting a normal tour, but they end up getting themselves into this really bad situation where it ends up being a manhunt, and so it's this kind of huge adventure across Europe as they kind of get themselves out of trouble. This book was kind of the start for me diving into more areas of historical fiction because it was just so fun. The tone was so lighthearted, and in my review of this book, I was just like, feels like as close as you could get to watching a movie while reading a book. There's just something about the author's writing style that's so vivid that I feel like I could see everything that was going on, and it was so dynamic. All the characters had such great conversations and such vibrant personalities, and even the plot and the adventure was so action-packed and exciting that I honestly, I couldn't count on knowing what was going to happen next. It was so so good. And let's not forget to mention the romance, Monty and Percy, so cute. Basically, from the beginning of the book, you know that Monty has had this crush on his best friend for the longest time, and it's so much pining back and forth, and so good. And I still haven't gotten around to reading the sequel yet from Felicity's point of view, where Felicity is also an amazing character. So she isn't just relegated to being the little sister. No, she is like, she's the main character. She has such a great attitude, and she's so confident, and she's so smart. Love her too. The next book is Pacheco by Minjin Lee. I will forever and always continue to recommend this to anyone and everyone who will listen. This book is it. It's so good. So it's a generational family drama following a Korean family starting in the early 1900s. We are really centered around Sunja. She is basically she's like the rock for this family. So we start from her childhood, her parents, then her, and then we follow her entire lineage. This time in history overlaps with Japan's occupation of Korea, so we kind of see Sunja trying to make a life for herself in Korea, but then ultimately going to Japan and trying to start a life there. We see kind of the divides, the ties, the love, and also the hatred that comes with being just kind of a really dynamic and just a very different kind of family. Honestly, the women in this family are just such strong characters. They really dominate the storyline. You really feel their pain and their struggle, but you also feel these real moments of happiness whenever something amazing happens to them. And so if you're nosy and you want to like get in with the family tea, this is another great book for that. There are also so many characters and storylines that I feel like you won't ever get bored when reading this book, although that could be kind of like a double-edged sword where it's like it's a lot to keep track of. But personally, I feel like the author did a really good job of weaving the stories in like at a good pace, so that you always kind of had a good idea of who was who, what was going on. Characters kind of faded out or faded back in as necessary. It was so good. Okay, so I know I said I don't like the World War II books set in Europe, but this is the one exception, the only exception I make in the case of good historical fiction, and that is the well-deserved The Book Thief by Mark Suzak. This is set in the 1930s and 1940s Nazi Germany, and it follows our main character Liesel, who is a lover of books and a lover of words in a time where a lot of books were getting destroyed to fit with the Nazi propaganda. So the reason why this book is my exception to the no World War II fiction is because while the World War II kind of motivates and influences everything that's happening to the characters, this book has a stronger focus on this love for books and love of telling stories in whatever form they may be. And so I feel like we didn't have to focus as much on like the war aspect, but we focused much more on what happens to those families during the war. It was much more on the family dynamic, the strength in friendships, and just being a decent, kind human being. It was such a powerful book, and I think really, really well written. So if you're gonna pick up any World War II fiction, this is the only one that I would recommend. And those are all of my historical fiction recommendations for if you normally don't like historical fiction. Please let me know in the comments if there are any that you would add to this list, and hopefully that'll change my mind also about a lot of the historical fiction I come across. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please click like. If you want to see more, click subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.